And we'll just launch into our presentation now. We'll take a little trip along the Florida Trail, along the Kissimmee River watershed. So share my screen. Okay. So as I said earlier, we took this hike back in January of this year. Seems like a lifetime ago. We were in the Kissimmee River area. This will give you an idea where this area is. It's just north of Lake Okeechobee, and it's south of the Disney World, and what you know as the town of Kissimmee. It's south of that, and there's a lake called Lake Kissimmee. There's a chain of lakes around there you can see here, and the Kissimmee River flows out of that chain of lakes and into Lake Okeechobee. So it's about a 4-hour drive from Jacksonville. And so this whole water system is interesting. You're probably familiar with the story of the Everglades, how the water flow has been diverted from its traditional flow because of making, farmlands and flood control, a series of dikes and canals and dams, and consequently the Everglades has pretty much dried up. Well, part of that story is the Kissimmee River itself, which feeds Lake Okeechobee, which then traditionally feeds the Everglades. So there's a huge levee around Lake Okeechobee so that water doesn't feed the Everglades the way it traditionally did. And as we'll see, there was a change made to the Kissimmee River that has also affected that flow. And so what happened is the traditional flow of the Kissimmee River is this meandering, beautiful little oxbow series of turns that is a slow-moving river from the chain of lakes of Lake Kissimmee down into the Okeechobee, Lake Okeechobee. And in 1947, there were a lot of bad hurricanes. The folks in the area requested flood control. So they built a canal and basically just straightened it. So here's what it looked like a few years ago. It just turned into a big canal, and they eliminated all these oxbows. And, they thought everything was, solved, and now they've improved everything. But what happened is they noticed that the waterfowl in the area was reduced by 90%. 90% of the birds that are the wading birds, the herons, the egrets, the storks, the cranes, just either deserted or died, and there were no birds anymore. And eagles were reduced by 70%. And all the fish species changed because the composition of oxygen in the water was changed. So they decided, whoops, we made a mistake. Let's put it back the way we found it. So that was a big project that ended up costing $1 billion. And it's just about ready. It's just about done. So they took a 44-mile section that you can see here. This kind of sort of the lines of the straight proportion here. This was the canal, or a portion of the canal, this 44-mile section. And then they backfilled that and then restored the original path of the river, the Kissimmee River, this meandering oxbow river. And so that was just about done when we started our hike last January. So I put in approximately what the route of our hike looked like. It's about 34 miles. And we'll talk in more detail about that. But it was nice because we were able to see some of the restoration process that had happened. We came up by this little turn in the river, and you'll see some pictures of that later on. So I'm going to take a quick break and see if we have any more people who need to be let in. Yep, a couple more. Okay, welcome newcomers. Sorry we were slow getting to you. Okay, so here's the route of the hike that we took, and so we began down here at this campsite called Starvation Slough. Now, what's a slough? A slough is a channel of water through an otherwise dry prairie or seasonally dry prairie, and that's what we're hiking through here. We'll talk more about that later. But sloughs maintain their moisture, their wetness most of the year, and some of them can get quite deep. So this was one of the sloughs, Starvation Slough. There's a campsite nearby. So we ended up meeting up at the top here at the northern end of our hike, and then combining in one car and driving to our southern end. And we then hiked northbound from south to north and to get back to our car. And so one thing to note if you're going to try this hike is that it's a very rural area, and there's also a river. And so there's not a good way to get across the river except a few bridges that cross on roads. And so the net sum of that is that it takes an hour and 45 minutes, believe it or not, between these two trailheads. So just allow that in your planning if you're going to be self-shuttling. So our itinerary was to drive down here, do the meeting, and drive down to the beginning, and then hike in about 4 miles, which is about all we had time for the first day, to this second campsite, which is called Starvation Slough North. And so that's what we did. The next day, we did about 10 miles, ended up inside the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park, which we'll talk about in a little bit, at a little campsite called Cowboy Crossing. And then the third day, we went up to the actual park itself, and we camped there. And then the last day was a long haul getting back to our cars through the prairie and across the river, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so this is the beginning, Starvation Slough Campground. So another thing to bear in mind if you're going to do this hike is that these parking areas and campsites are secured by a lock. You can see the lock on that gate there. You need to get a permit to be able to camp and park in these areas from the Kissimmee River Water Management District. And then they will get you a passcode, and then you use that to open the combination of this lock. And that's the only way to get in. They change the lock, the passcode once a month. So get your timing right. And it's all done online. It's a little complicated, probably overly complicated, but just bear in mind you got to do that to be able to park in here. And as you can see, you have a little bit of a shelter here, but we just use it for parking. And then, as I said, we hiked in 4 miles. So the first 4 miles, we crossed Starvation Slough. So you can see here in the lower right-hand corner, that is a very, very dry slough. There was not a lot of water, thankfully, at all in the park, at any of these sloughs. And those that had a lot of water in it, there were easy ways to get across it. So in many cases, this hike is typically a very wet hike. You'll get your feet wet. In our case, we got lucky and it really wasn't that wet. So we hiked in and we went to this campsite first night. And one thing that's all around, but we didn't see any, but we just saw the evidence, is these feral pigs. You can see, maybe you could see how the land is so dug up here. Everywhere it was all dug up. These pigs are out there. And we didn't hear them or see them, but we definitely could feel the bumps, under our feet as we get into these campsites. Second day, then we proceeded north along the Florida Trail. And we went through, first off, this beautiful palm forest. And they call this the Cathedral of Palms South. And it's called that because there's a Cathedral of Palms North, which was named first. And that's in the St. Mark's area, which is up around the Big Bend of Florida. And along the Florida Trail there, near St. Mark's, in the St. Mark's National Wildlife Reserve, there is the original Cathedral of Palms, which is just awe-inspiring. It is like a cathedral. You're walking through this forest of beautiful, tall, straight palm trees everywhere you look. As far as you can see, there are these tall, straight palm trunks, and that's kind of what you got here. I mean, it's really impressive walking through this, and you can get a sense of scale looking at my picture down here at the bottom. Second, we came along in our hike, we came to this bend in the river, in the Kissimmee River, which is very pretty after going through a lot of oak forests and oak hammocks and palm forests. And we kind of came out into the open area. There's a path to the river, and it's a nice little place to visit. There's a campsite down here, but we had further to go, but it's a very pretty area. Then we continued north and then walked through more oak hammock. Now, what's a hammock? A hammock is an island of hardwood forest. And so that's typically the way you'll find hardwood forests in Florida, at least south of the Panhandle. You'll find them in islands or clumps where they're surrounded by other habitats, such as a marsh or a pine forest or a prairie in this case. And they're a little higher elevation, and that's what allows the hardwoods to grow because there's a little less water, and they're also less frequent fire. So you'll see, as we talk about the prairie is basically defined by fire. And there are many other habitats in Florida that also are defined by fire, and that's how they get their unique characteristics. And what makes these oak hammocks different than a pine forest is they don't have that frequent fires, and that allows these oaks, beautiful oaks, to grow. They're also home to barred owls. You probably have heard barred owls if you've been out about in the evening or night. You know, they're the ones that go, "Who cooks for you?" That distinctive sound. And so there's tons of those throughout these oak hammocks, and it's very, very enjoyable. After the hammocks, we came out into prairie, and this is a very unique ecosystem in Florida. Those of us who live on the coast may not know much about it, or in the North Florida area too. We don't see this much. It's really Central Florida, and it's just like being in the Midwest. You can see these vistas, long vistas with no trees and totally flat. Well, all of Florida's flat, but there's no trees to break up the horizon at all. It's just this beautiful expanse of native grasses, and just a beautiful thing. Very different. So let me go back. So one thing about the dry prairie is their hydro period, meaning that the time that they're damp during a year, is less than 3 months, and a wet prairie would be greater than 6 months. So half the year, if you have a wet condition, you're going to have what's called a wet prairie. But these are dry prairies, and they're just seasonally damp. Most of the time, very dry. And so now we're going through the next area, which is a big slough, which is called Duck Slough. And so this gives you an idea of how deep some of these sloughs can get. They're almost like you're looking at a river or a little creek. And so in this case, it was nice that somebody built a nice little footbridge across that slough. So we didn't have to get wet there either. Then after the slough, we walking through more prairie. Now, one thing about hiking this is we went at a nice cool time of year, and it was very sunny, but it was not oppressive. But if you went in a hot time, you really got to watch the sun, because there's absolutely no tree cover for miles. All right, so then that second night we got to the Cowboy Crossing campsite. And this is in a beautiful oak hammock. It's just really pretty. We had some neighbors, a barred owl who just made their nest up there above us. And we had every one of these campsites had these pitcher pumps, and they actually work. They're brand new, nice new ones. There's a lot on the Florida Trail that are iffy, but these are brand new and they work great, which was good because this is all agricultural area. So typically, for those of you who don't backpack, you may not know, but you don't carry all your water typically, or you wouldn't make it. It's too heavy. So you have to find local water sources along the way and filter your water. But in an agricultural area like this, there's a lot of runoff that's, maybe chancy even when you're filtering, that you probably don't want to get into it. So this is really nice that we really had water sources along the way when we camped. So that's another nice thing about this route. Okay, so then we got into Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. Cowboy Crossing is in the state park, so we'd already crossed in the boundary and gotten into the Kissimmee Prairie State Park. And so This is the largest remaining tract of Florida dry prairie, which is one of the most diverse habitats in North America. It doesn't look it, but there's 100 to 200 different plant species per acre in this habitat. One interesting thing about the park is they don't allow any signage or blazes. Blazes are the signs you see on trees when you're hiking, you know, to indicate what the route is. And this blazes are throughout the Florida Trail from, you know, from Everglades to Pensacola. You'll see these orange blazes, which indicate Florida Trail. But this is one section where you won't see blazes because they don't allow signs or high poles because they're trying to protect the endangered Florida grasshopper sparrow, which is endemic to this area. And it's a favorite meal of the raptors who live in the oak hammocks nearby. So the more places they have to perch and view their prey, the better and more successful they are at catching their prey. So they try to minimize that in the park. So you just have to look for the path, which is pretty clear, but there's no blazes throughout. I don't know, it's probably 8 or 10 miles of this park. Now, these habitats I mentioned are very interesting. They are fire dominated, so they're dependent on a fire at an interval of 1 to 4 years, and that's what keeps them clear of other trees and other brush growing up and keeps these grasses, which are fire tolerant, growing and healthy. Some of the wildlife or bird life you'll see are the Florida grasshopper sparrow. As I mentioned, that's an endangered species, and it's endemic to this area. You don't find it anywhere else except for this dry prairie of Florida. And we actually saw quite a few. I mean, they're doing a good job of bringing them back. We saw quite a few Florida grasshopper sparrow. We saw a lot of red-shouldered hawk. We saw a lot of barred owl, but I did not see the crested caracara, which is a real fun bird to see. I haven't seen him since South Florida. All right, so on the third night, we came to a campsite that's in the state park area. And so it's a more traditional campsite. You got to reserve it, and you know, you can bring your cars in and your RVs in. So we were in that kind of an area, but it was kind of welcome with all that we've been through and all the wetness and the sweat and everything. We actually got real working bathrooms and showers. They actually have showers at this campsite. So this was like our luxury day. So they call this the equestrian campground. That's because there's an equestrian area. So you can, some of the people will bring their horse trailers in, and then there's a corral there, and they can leave the horses in the corral and go out trail riding on some of these trails throughout the prairie. Okay, so another neat thing about this hike in this particular park is that it's officially designated as a dark sky. There's an International Dark Sky Association, and they award this designation to areas where there's very little light pollution, and so the sky is visible at night to be able to see the stars and the celestial bodies. This was the first in Florida to be declared a dark sky park. And so it's a really neat place. We deliberately chose to go there during a new moon. So there was no moon and it was pretty clear. So you could see the sun setting here and how beautiful the sky is. But then I don't have an astronomy camera, so I don't have any great star pictures, but your whole sky was just filled with stars. I mean, it was almost hard to pick out the constellations. There were just so many stars, but when you did, you could see the entire zodiac that was, you know, in that portion of the sky at that time. Now these bodies here, it might look like it's the moon, but actually these are two planets. That's how bright they were and how dark that sky is. So it's just a really cool place to be. And they have another area that's walking distance from the equestrian campground that they call astronomy pads. So these amateur astronomers bring in their campers full of their astronomy equipment, their telescopes, their computers, all of their guidebooks, and they set up on these astronomy pads. And so you can go over there and, you know, look through the telescopes if they let you, and they're just, you know, getting a really good shot of these stars. And so in those areas, they don't allow any light except the red spectrum light. So when you have your headlight on, you know, that you wear when you're camping, there's a red light option. You have to turn that on. You can't have a white light up there. No campfires allowed up there. And you maybe noticed on a bathroom, I'll go back to that. Even on the bathroom, see, they have the red lights. They don't have white lights there. So it's all to preserve this dark sky effect here. And it was just a whole lot of fun. So on day 4, we took off again up north through the northern part of the park, through more prairie. And here you can see a big, deep slough that we had to cross without a bridge, but we were able to jump it because over to this side, it was still a little narrow. So we were able to get through. See some wading birds here. This was called 5 Mile Slough. And then there's another one that's 7 Mile Slough because they're 5 and 7 miles out. And as we came around to the top of the park and we came out of the north side of the park, the trail then crosses the Kissimmee River. So this is the point where the river restoration begins. You can see to the left where it's sort of winding around in that winding river route. And then to the north, it's north of this lock, which is, you know, controls the flow from this canal, which is still a canal. It's not restored river. So you cross over the lock. And then you enter a section called Kisso. And so this is another interesting historical aspect of this hike that, you know, maybe you don't know that Central Florida has been a cattle raising country for hundreds of years. The first cattle came when the Spanish came. Actually, Ponce de Leon brought cattle with him, and he just left them behind because after he'd eaten them, he took off and he had left over, and they just survived and continued to breed, and they became kind of wild cattle. Some of the Indians began to tend the cattle, and some of the settlers who came in afterwards would be ranchers. And by the 1800s, the Indians were as good ranchers as any of the colonial settlers. And so there was a lot of fighting over who owned the cattle and a lot of cattle rustling and all that. And that was one of the cause of the 2 Seminole Wars that we had in Florida. And in the early 1900s, you'd have cattle drives from this area down to Lake Okeechobee of, you know, 1,000 head, 1,200 head cattle drives coming down, if you can imagine that. So Florida is a really big cattle state. And so this area was Kisso, it's called for short, for the Kissimmee Cattle Company. So it was a big ranch operation that operated there. There was even a town in 1915 through the 1920s. And now it's a ghost town. So as you go through here, you can take a little side detour and go visit the ghost town. But now most of it's these beautiful old oak hammocks and then these ranch lands to the side where they converted the prairie to grazing area for the cattle. So that's the story of Kisso, and that's the story of our hike, because at the end of this, there was a Kisso campsite, and that's where we left our cars and got in our cars and went home. It was a really, really, really fun 4 days.